Welcome everyone. Really pleased you can join us today. As you may have noticed when you signed in, we are recording today's session. My name is Sian Basker. I am Co-Chief Executive at Data Orchard, and I'm delighted to be here to present our 2024 State of the Sector Data Maturity Report. I'd like to introduce the authors of the report, my colleagues Hannah Khwaja. Hannah is our analysis and impact lead at Data Orchard, and Libby Harkins, give us a wave, Libby, as well, is our analytics engineer and product lead. So how it's going to run today is I'm going to kick off with setting some context and background. I'm going to hand over to Libby, who's going to talk about the overall findings, what kinds of organisations are interested in taking data maturity, where they're from. Hannah's going to do a bit more of a deep dive into some of the differences between the not-for-profit sector and the public sector. Then I'm going to do a wrap-up at the end, and there will be time for Q&A. So you'll see in your menu on Teams here that there is a Q&A function. Perhaps Libby or you could demonstrate the Q&A function for anyone who hasn't used it before. We are hoping to have lots of time to hear from you, your curiosities and your questions about this research. So you have the option of doing Q&A anonymously if you prefer. We won't be using any of your names, obviously, because it's recorded. Please do use the upvote button. So if you see a question that somebody else has put in and you'd really like to hear the discussion and answers around those, then please do upvote those things. So I think that's it by way of initial introductions. So I think I would like to start by telling you a little bit of a story, a short story about how we got here. So Data Orchard, for those of you who don't know us, is a social enterprise, and we were set up in 2013 by a group of people who came from public sector and charity sector backgrounds with a shared interest in the power of data for making the world a better place, socially, economically, environmentally. Fairly soon into our existence, we joined up with some partners at DataKind with a shared interest of trying to understand where the sector is at with data and trying to understand what good and great looked like. And so we thought, well, we'll go and have a look at all these data maturity models. For background, this was just on the back of all the big data fanfare of around 2010. So there was lots of excitement at that time. And we looked at all these models and found most of them were very technically focused, very analytically focused, and mostly aimed at massive corporate commercial organisations. And we didn't find anything that was relevant to the non-profit sector. So we spent a couple of years engaging with the sector, finding out what was going on, understanding what good and great looked like, what kind of factors were important in data maturity. And we came up with our first model, I suppose, our first framework of data maturity in 2017. And that was all well and good, but it was just a theoretical model. And it was like a sort of 12-page PDF document. And people said, well, that's all very good, but what questions should I be asking myself about this? And so we also thought it would be quite important for us to kind of understand how organisations could self-assess. And so we spent a couple of years doing user research on who we should ask about data maturity, what questions we should ask, what was the shortest amount of time they could spend answering the questions for us to give an idea of how they're doing. So in 2019, we launched this online tool, the Data Maturity Assessment Tool. And of course, in doing so, we immediately updated the whole framework in a fairly substantial way. So version 2 of the data maturity framework, like the underlying model, happened then. And then we went live, which was tremendously exciting. We just did an individual version of the tool, which is still available free. And that's really just one person's perspective on data. what we realized in our research was that you need lots of people are involved in data, and you need lots of perspectives. So we developed an organization tool in 2020 that was designed for multiple people to take the assessment. And that followed in 2021 with the cohort one, which is about multiple people in multiple organizations. Whole different story. I'll tell you about that later. There have been some reports along the way. So our first report was based on 2020 data. In 2022, after having had the tool run for quite a while, we tweaked that framework a bit, and we tweaked our assessment a bit, because we discovered that people in all kinds of different organizations were using it. Commercial organizations were using it, public sector organizations were doing it. So we tweaked it to make it universally applicable to any organisation in any sector. So there have been a whole series of reports. I'm delighted to say today we're presenting the fourth in our series of State of the Sector reports. So that's been a really exciting journey for us. I'm very pleased to say that the assessment itself is 5 years old. We just celebrated our birthday. I suppose it might be useful, because I'm setting the context, to just re-clarify some definitions. So when we're talking about data maturity, we define that as an organisation's journey towards improvement and increased capability in using data. And we've got a really broad, holistic definition of data. We talk about all the kinds of information an organisation collects and stores and analyses. And it's not just the numbers and the spreadsheets and the databases. It can include what's in your documents, social media, images, videos, maps, the whole lot. And because it's everywhere, in everybody's job, in every service and department, and because it's so pervasive and broad, it's really helpful to have a structure to help understand and frame it. So that's really where we came from with our data maturity framework. So referring back to that research we did some time ago, we identified these 7 key themes that are absolutely crucial to success with data. A couple of them are very practical, like the tools and the data, how you collect it. A couple of them are very much about purpose. So the uses, how you're using it for external services, how you're using it for internal capacity building and capabilities in your organisation, and the ways in which you're analysing it are all, what are you using the data for, and how do you explore and make sense of it for the benefit of your organisation. Most importantly, what we discovered is several of these themes are about people, and people are absolutely critical. So leadership, skills and culture are fundamental parts of that data maturity journey. And when you combine these themes together, it enables an organisation to advance through this 5-stage journey, from unaware through emerging, learning, developing and mastering. So our assessment essentially delves into those 7 themes in a lot more detail. We have a set of questions. Actually, we have over 100 questions, but don't tell anyone, because they'll never take the assessment if you tell them there's that much in it. But we have managed to get it down to about 20 minutes, which is the average amount of time that it takes to really explore all of those 7 themes. So I'm going to just give a quick overview of the assessment tool and the users. So we now have almost 12,000 users of the tool, and over 1,000 validated organisations. By validated, I mean like these are definitely organisations that exist. So we have to strip out all of those personal email addresses and rogue users or duplicates. So the reason there's that difference between the number of users and the number of organisations is that we match multiple users from one organisation into one data point for an organisation. And as you can see, over the 5 years, it's really grown. It's been really exciting. We've now got users from 56 countries around the world. We've been doing a lot of impact and evaluation and getting lots of feedback since the tool has been live. And we're really delighted that the tool is showing that it has a real impact around engaging and educating and motivating people in organisations to improve with data. So 5 years of data. Here's our officialization, as we call it. I'd have to thank Libby for being the producer of this officialization. We've got, as I say, there are 1,039 organisations. We've around a quarter of those organisations are from commercial organisations, around 15% are public sector, and the others 60%-ish are non-profit, not-for-profit organisations. So it does give me an opportunity to just do some quick definitions. I honestly could go insane trying to categorise organisations. So I'm just going to be really clear here at a headline level. When we talk about not-for-profit, we're talking about trusts and charities and social enterprises, NGOs, some people call it the voluntary sector, some people call it the third sector, although I'm very reluctant to call it the third sector because that kind of implies some bronze status, and I would very much argue that we don't see the evidence for that. But essentially, it's social mission organisations. In the public sector, it includes local, regional, national government. There's quite a lot of health organisations and education organisations in there, like schools as well. And the commercial side, these are public and private limited companies. So it's a real mix in there. As we go through today's presentation, some important terminology. We use the word client. By that, we mean whatever you want to call them, but it's our catchphrase for your service users, your participants, members, your students, your clients, your customers, your beneficiaries, however you want to call them. And similarly, when we use the term staff, we're talking about your employees, maybe volunteers. It could involve freelancers or other people who work for you to deliver what you do. The fish, each fish represents an organisation. The scores range, when we're talking about data maturity scores, we're talking in relation to this 5-stage journey from 0 to 5. And when we talk about averages, we're talking about median. So if you lined them all up in a row and took the midpoint, then that would be your median average. Now, while it breaks my heart not to use all of the available data, most of today's session is going to focus on the 4 complete financial years. So I'm going to hand over to Libby, who's going to give us an initial look at the actual findings from this research.
Brilliant, yes. And just to say, also just adding on there that sometimes we'll group not-for-profit and public sector organisations together, and we refer to them as non-profits, which sometimes catches us out in wording. So we'll start with an overview of data maturity in the non-profit sector. So look at how the non-profit sector has scored itself in terms of data maturity. And beginning with zooming in just on the last financial year, so April 2023 to March 2024. And starting with the chart on the left, you'll see that the average data maturity score is 3 out of 5. So just right on that edge between learning and developing. This is a slight increase on previous years, but we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. But I'd like to highlight the big range of responses or the range of scores we have. So we have organisations all the way from unaware to mastering. So the lowest scoring organisation is down there, the little lone guy at 0.6. And then we have organisations scoring themselves right up to 4.8 out of 5. But the vast majority, 82%, are in that learning and developing stage. And then on this chart on the right, we're looking more into how organisations scored themselves at a theme level. So each dot represents one organisation assessment and where it scored on that theme. And again, you can see there's a really large range of results, but on average, organisations are scoring themselves higher in culture, data and uses, and a little bit lower in skills, analysis and leadership. And then tools is right on the middle there. And also on that chart on the right, you'll see the big black dot is the overall median. So zooming out to the past 4 years and comparing the overall scores, we can see there is a slight increase in data maturity score. So we're going from an average of 2.7 in 2020 to 2021 to an average of 3 just about in 2023 to 2024. And you'll see that the number of organizations in those top 2 stages, so developing and mastering, is increasing slightly. So back in 2020, we only had 1% of organizations in the mastering stage, but now we have 7% of organizations. But every year we kind of anticipate seeing a really big jump in the number of organizations in those higher stages, just because there's so much discussion and excitement, and with AI particularly recently. But each year it is just that incremental kind of small increase, which makes sense because data maturity takes a long time to improve. It doesn't happen quickly in 3 to 6 months. It takes years of time and investment. And so that's reflected kind of when we look at a sector level, things are changing slowly. But still, every year it's a little increase. And then looking at the theme level, so this is just looking at the first financial year, 2020 to 2021 in red, and then in that kind of dark navy is the 2023 to 24. We're seeing the highest increase in scores in culture and uses. You've got a good solid kind of bump up in culture there, a little bit in uses. A very slight increase in data analysis and tools, an even smaller increase in leadership. But importantly, we're not seeing any increase in skills at all. So it's kind of been stuck at that 2.6, 2.7 out of 5 for the last 4 years. So it's really interesting. And we're going to look a little bit more into the skills theme and maybe why or why not that's not changing a little bit later. So looking more specifically at differences in sectors and geographies, still in this kind of 4-year lens, 74% of organisations who took the assessment were based in the UK, and organisations not in the UK came from over 50 different countries. So the most common countries that organisations came from were English-speaking countries. So we had around 50 different organisations from Canada. We had quite a lot from the USA and Australia. And the rest of the countries had fewer than 10 organisations associated with them. So it is a far-reaching tool, but I would say kind of a large portion of the sample is from the UK. And so looking into the UK in a bit more detail, this chart is showing how different regions of the UK scored themselves in data maturity. So Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, on average, are scoring themselves higher than England. I don't know if anyone has any theories or hypotheses about why this might be the case, but it's definitely an interesting thing for us to dig into. So the red bars on the right are showing the average data maturity score, and then we're seeing in grey the number of organisations. So unsurprisingly, there's a lot of organisations from London, and we might be a little bit underrepresented on kind of eastern areas of England, so North East, East Midlands, East England. We've got slightly less organisations from those areas. And we also had a little look at subsector. So we got these subsector categories based on the International Classification of Non-Profit Organisations. So when we were part of a validation process, when we have an organisation, we look at what activities it conducts, and we just think which of these categories it would most be suitable to fit into. So at the top here, scoring themselves most highly, we've got government organisations and emergency services, although not that many organisations are in those top 2. And at the bottom, we have culture and recreation, religion, social services scoring themselves a little lower. And social services is quite a broad category. It includes family services, services for the elderly, temporary shelters, refugee assistance, income support and maintenance. So it is quite broad. And that might contribute to why we've got quite a lot of organisations sitting in there. But we've also got quite a few in health and in education, and they're activities that we find both not-for-profit and public sector organisations kind of operate in, so they kind of garner a few more. But in general, there isn't a great difference between subsectors. So the range is from 2.6 to 3.3. So pretty much every subsector is sitting within that early developing, late learning stage of data maturity. So this chart is actually zooming back out to the 5 years just to kind of solidify the point. But going back to our main three sectors, not-for-profit, public sector and commercial, is that we're not seeing any significant difference between these sectors. So when we look at the average score, public sector does seem to edge ahead of not-for-profit sector. But when we kind of delve into it, that range of results really means that there isn't anything that we can say one sector is definitely above the other. But we do think it's interesting to look at differences and comparisons. So we're going to chop out commercial from now onwards and look at just not-for-profit and public sector and kind of how they compare on different themes and questions. And Hannah's going to go into that a little bit.
Thank you, Libby. So if we have a look at comparing the not-for-profit sector and public sector at a theme level, we can see that the public sector appears to be ahead on almost all of the different themes, although the difference is quite slight. So particularly they seem to be ahead in relation to analysis, data, uses and culture. Pretty similar in terms of skills, tools and leadership. But across all of the themes, even where the average theme scores were similar, we found that there are areas where the public sector and not-for-profits have different strengths and weaknesses. And so we'll start with a few areas where non-profits are edging slightly ahead of the public sector. And note to say that when we use the word strengths here, we are referring to comparative strengths between not-for-profits and the public sector. So it doesn't always mean that the data shows that one sector is really good at something, but they are comparatively better than the other. So starting with not-for-profit strengths. First of all, we'll take a look at leadership attitudes, and there's quite a lot going on in this chart and some small text, so I'll just explain it a bit. From the left-hand side, we've got a descriptive statement which illustrates leadership at their most engaged, all the way across to the right-hand side, which is where leadership are not interested in data at all. The greenish teal colour that's the largest chunks in the middle is where leadership knows that data is important, but they're not convinced about its value. And anything towards the other side is where leaders don't see any value in the data. So what we are seeing is that not-for-profit organisations feel in general that their leadership are more engaged with data. They're much more likely than public sector organisations to say that their leadership are engaged, they're supportive, and they ask the right questions of data, and they're active in harnessing its value. And we also found that they're more likely to say that they have an organisational plan for improvement in data, or that they're in the process of actively creating one. Moving on to a second not-for-profit strength. So we found that not-for-profits were more confident in their data quality than public sector organisations. So not-for-profits were more likely to agree that they collected data that was relevant, meaningful and necessary. They were more likely to feel that they knew the quality of the data they collected and that that data was recorded in consistent, efficient ways, and that the data that they held was complete, accurate and kept up to date. And they were also more likely to report that their files and documents were centrally and securely stored and that they were well organised and managed. So 30% of not-for-profits agreed that their staff found it easy to find the information that they needed, compared with only 14% of public sector organisations. And a final strength of not-for-profits is that when they're asked about to what extent data and analytics influences their services, we can see this really big difference between not-for-profits and public sector in terms of evidencing their impact to stakeholders. They're also slightly more likely to say that they use data to evidence the problems that their organisations are seeking to address, and also more likely to agree that they use data to improve their reach and engagement with clients and to target services and interventions to clients. There's also another question about how data and analytics influences capabilities, and as well as this higher level of using data to evidence impact to stakeholders, and not-for-profits are also more likely to say that data actually actively helps them to improve that impact as well. But to be fair, if we have a look at these charts, we can see that there's quite a lot of room for improvement across both of the sectors. Moving on to some areas where the public sector are edging ahead of not-for-profits. Here we can see that public sector organisations are more likely than not-for-profits to report using more complex forms of analysis. So we ask about 5 different forms of analysis in our data maturity assessment. The first is basic counts and charts, which will be very familiar to everybody. We also ask about descriptive analytics. So this is about what has happened. So summarising averages, looking at variations and ranges, perhaps looking at past trends. We then ask about diagnostic analytics. So this is about why something happened. So drilling down into exploring causes, patterns, looking at anomalies and any correlations or differences. We also ask about predictive analytics. So this is about what is going to happen in the future. So things like forecasting, modelling trends, looking at behaviour patterns or machine learning. And finally, prescriptive analytics, which are about how you can take action in the best way. So this is things like optimization, experimental design and simulations, and artificial intelligence. So we can see that the public sector organisations are much more likely to be using these more advanced forms of analysis, such as diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive analytics. And in line with these more complex forms of analysis, the public sector are more likely to report using specialist tools, such as SAS, R, Python, or GIS mapping. So half of not-for-profits said that their organisations weren't using specialist tools at all, and a quarter weren't sure whether their organisation were using these tools or not. The public sector organisations were also more likely to report using business intelligence tools, so dashboard and data visualisation tools such as Power BI. But it's interesting to note that our findings suggest that tools and systems in the public sector are less well organised. So public sector organisations were less likely to agree that their tools and systems were centrally managed, and that their organisation thought about integration between different tools when they were purchasing new products. And finally, the public sector seems to be significantly further ahead than not-for-profits in terms of data protection and security related aspects of culture and skills. So public sector organisations were much more likely to agree that they had robust policies and practices in place around data protection, that their staff received induction and regular training on data protection and security, and that their staff knew how to respond to a data breach, potential breach, or a near miss. But having said that, it's important to note that this chart here combines the strongly and somewhat agree. And we found that only 15% of public sector and 20% of not-for-profit organisations strongly agreed that they were confident about the security of data held on paper computers and other devices in their organisation. I mean, arguably, you can never be fully confident that your data is protected. The risks and threats around security are huge and increasing. It's important to remember that this is an issue that will need to be continuously addressed into the future. And now I'm going to hand back to Sian, and she's going to talk us through every sector's weakness.
Thank you, Hannah. So, skills, everybody's weakness, and no progress in 5 years. A bit disappointing, really. But I think it's worth having a really good delve into skills, because what we found is everyone spends a lot of time working with data. In our assessment, we asked people to pick up to 3 of these standard job categories. So we recognise that often people wear multiple hats in their work, and we asked them roughly how much of their time do they spend working with data? And we've done this with lots and lots of organisations, and it pretty well always comes out at around half of staff time being spent working with data. Obviously, some of those roles are you would expect. So obviously, if your job is about data and analysis, thank goodness they're doing their job. Finance people are obvious ones as well. The kinds of people who are working in impact and evaluation and research, and the IT people and administrators definitely are doing lots and lots of work with data. But even at the other end of the spectrum, even those that are using data least in their work are still using it at spending about 30% of their job. A good third, if not more, of their job is spent working with data. So it does very much feel like it's everybody's job. So when we think about, what kinds of jobs are data jobs, it's we do ask people for their job roles when they complete the assessment, and so far we've had almost 4,000 different roles given. This little word cloud here is the list of the most common ones we see. I do feel fairly reassured by this, that our assessment is not being taken just by data people. And in fact, among our most rare users include like zookeepers and a crematorium manager I came across recently. So, there are all kinds of people using data in their work. Just to go back, just to point on some of these more common ones. Obviously, we've got the team leaders, project managers, CEOs, service managers, social workers, solicitors are in there. And there are some data ones in there. We have got some data analysts and business analysts in there among the most common types of job roles. Our conclusion really is that everyone, because data is part of everybody's job in every organisation, it really is a case that everyone needs to learn. And these are some of the findings from the research where, the first thing I'd like to do is just draw your attention to the enormity of the white space in the chart, just to highlight the gap in skills at a general level. And secondly, I'd like to draw your attention to the title on the x-axis, which is that we are being quite generous in that we are including the somewhat agree in the overall results here alongside the strongly agree. So we deliberately use those on that sort of scale. We have the strongly agree and somewhat agree, and I would say those who are saying somewhat agree are going, yeah, rather than, yeah, we definitely do that. But anyway, generously, we've combined those two feelings together in a general agreement. And what we see is, overall, we see capacity is a major problem. Less than a quarter of organisations say that they've got appropriate numbers of staff managing and developing their data capabilities. Most don't understand their needs in this area of skills at all. Focusing on the chart in this slide, just focusing on leadership, 28% of non-profits are saying that they've got people with data and analytics expertise within their leadership, a quarter in public sector. In the middle pair of lines there, we've got the more technical skills, so that actually these are people who have got the proper data skills, and the non-profit sector, 22% say they've got the right skills and capabilities to maximise their data. For the public sector, it's 16%. And then finally, kind of looking at the sort of everybody skills, looking at data literacy, around a quarter of non-profits are agreeing that most staff are data literate. And again, for the public sector, it's lower at 16. So there's definitely a skills problem in the sector. And we've seen this and reported on this for several years. What I think is quite exciting is that there are opportunities to build on what's there, given that everybody is working with data and is using data in their jobs. So there are opportunities to better coordinate skills and expertise and to support staff in their analytics and knowledge. My final slide before wrapping up is about different perspectives. So we've used something called the interquartile range here, which is basically if you were to lay out all of the responses on a scale from the smallest to the highest, and you chop off the top quarter and you chop off the bottom quarter, what you're left with is what's here in those dumbbells that you can see on the screen. What's really interesting to us in this, so we've taken those top most popular job roles that we've seen in the job titles, is at the top there, you're seeing quite a lot of more frontline organisations, frontline staff who are tending to score a little bit higher. I was curious about the solicitor, but actually we have got a lot of law and legal advice organisations in the set, so maybe that accounts for that, and also the housing people. These, I mean, it may be, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your curiosities on this. Please put some questions in the Q&A if you haven't already. You know, at that, and those higher scores may indicate that data's less of a problem in the kind of operational, kind of more frontlines end of things. But then if you look at the bottom of the list and you've got CEOs, directors, program managers, these tend to be like more senior roles. Plus you've got a couple of data roles in there. So the data analysts and the business analysts are definitely scoring the organisation much lower. The organisation's much lower than the frontline staff. So I think that concurs with some of the other findings that we've seen. I'm interested to hear your hunches on these things. I am going to just quickly wrap up here with some reflections, really. I mean, I would say undoubtedly there are challenges for every organisation with data. I feel really encouraged that so many are taking an interest. I think on the back of this really rapid digital adoption that we've seen, particularly since the pandemic, there's been a lot of digital maturity going on. And of course, in the face of AI, I don't know if anyone's heard, it's all the rage. And of course, AI is presenting lots of opportunities and risks. And I think for any organisation trying to get their heads around what that means and how they put in place guardrails, how they take advantage of those kinds of tools and analyses and opportunities will be exciting to see. And already we know that what we're seeing is that growing number at the forefront in all sectors, some real pioneers who are doing quite incredible things with data at the moment. And what we know is that when we talk to those organisations, they tell us they've been working at it for a long time. So we know organisations are complex, we know data is complex, we know change takes time, and there's a lot of learning going on. So with a quick what next, I've got a few calls to actions for different audiences. If you are policymakers or funders, we would really, invest across all sectors. I know there's been a lot of government investment in the public sector. Haven't seen much coming to the not-for-profit sector. That would be really good. It would be wonderful to see more funding for space and time for learning, especially for leaders. I think we know many funders offer capacity building programs for their grantees. It would be really great to see building data capabilities among those capacities that you're seeking to support. Capacity builders on the same theme, like if you run networks or you are in membership groups, do raise more awareness and understanding about data, explore the appetite and needs, look at developing data maturity at scale. We've got some other events I'll talk to you about around cohorts, but the opportunity to build data communities within networks, within organisations that are operating in similar contexts will be really helpful. And of course, role model the journey for your members as well. If you're a non-profit and you haven't already assessed your data maturity, please do so. Do start having conversations about data in your organisation, and above all, keep learning. And finally, for data people, do join our Data Folk Club. It's a monthly free get-together. It's an opportunity to meet with peers and to do some professional sharing, potentially some therapy sometimes around the challenges of data. And we have lots of events. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I wanted to leave time for a few Q&A questions. Thank you to everybody. Thanks for all the fish. I know lots of your organisations will have contributed your data and taken our assessment. So it is time for Q&A, of which I haven't been watching the Q&A. So if you haven't already asked a question, please do. If you have, if you get an opportunity now, please go into the Q&A and upvote anything you would like to hear us respond to. I'll stop sharing for now. And leave it to Libby to facilitate some questions from the floor.
Yeah.
From, I don't know, virtual space, whatever we call it.
The ether. Yeah, there's loads of questions. Thank you. A really interesting chat. And I think I'm going to start with the question with the most upvotes, which I think will bring in some of what maybe was being discussed in the chat. But it's, have you noted that people/organisations sometimes overestimate their maturity levels from self-assessments? And if so, how can you deal with these deviations?
Yeah, yes, we have, I think is the answer. I think it is, it's a challenging thing for people to not know, when people don't know what they don't know. And I think one of the things that's been most interesting to us is organisations that have done repeat assessments. So perhaps the first assessment might be seen as a baseline. I would definitely say it's not necessarily a linear journey from to advance with data maturity, and particularly around knowledge and skills. You do, I mean, you always get optimists in organisations, and I think for people who are not necessarily constrained in their work, perhaps some of those frontline people, by some of the challenges of data, it works fine for them. You know, they're doing their work, they can look up who they're working with, they can record what they're doing, you know, they can access the records that they need to do their job. I think once organisations start to advance, sometimes you get a pushback, particularly around users. So in the users thing, perhaps there's an assumption that someone in the organisation is doing this stuff, or that they already kind of, well, they just assume somebody else in the organisation's done it, which is why the conversation that follows the data maturity assessment is so important. You know, that when you discover, we always find these disparities of opinion. Sometimes they're quite stark, and that difference, you know, particularly if you're doing internal benchmarking, for example, and you find some teams have scored the organisation really well, and you might go in and find they are doing absolutely amazing things, and from their view, it is incredible. Or it might be that they just didn't interpret things in the same way, or they assumed some things were happening that weren't. I don't know if others have got other things to add that I may have missed.
No, I agree. And I think what was maybe being chatted about a bit that I would agree with is that sometimes the people who are more using the data, or more kind of the data person, will be more critical because they know what's possible, and then sometimes might be, why do you all think everything's fine when my perspective it's not. Okay, another question with quite a lot of upvotes, which is interesting. What are your recommendations for addressing those gaps in data skills in organisations which realistically cannot hire more people and have limited resources? How do you create space and appetite to focus on increasing data literacy skills? A good, tricky one.
Hannah, do you want to start? So there's a different voice.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the important thing, particularly with the data that we've shown here, is that it's not necessarily that you need more people, it's that the people that you already have in the organisation need more skills. So I think particularly our focus on thinking about leadership skills and leadership engagement is key, because in order to, as you say, create that space and the appetite to focus on increasing data literacy skills, you need the people at the top to be on board in order to make that space and that time available for learning and filling in those skills gaps. But yes, we absolutely acknowledge that limited resources are a massive barrier, and that lots of people in non-profit organisations are already trying to do multiple jobs at the same time, and it can be very tough. But we have a few accessible resources that we like to use with our sort of data skills for everyone training. So we offer a couple of different courses that we can run in-house, which include data skills for everyone and then data for leaders. And there are some nice, very sort of entry-level fun, hopefully, with a bit of persuasion activities to sort of introduce people into ways of thinking about data, rather than starting off with very technical approaches, starting to get people to think about data in different ways and get them engaged. Do you want to add anything to that, Libby?
Yeah, I would add a few things. I suppose one of the things I would say is we are seeing like shared resource approaches. So, for example, having in some networks we've seen it where one person works with like 5 different organisations to provide technical support. We've also seen some cross-sector appetite for that in the public sector, particularly in the Northwest, where there's been a lot of pooling expertise and kind of working with the best and being a shared resource among multiple organisations. There are a number of really good pro bono schemes available that range from pro bono economics, spreadsheet first aid, and data science work with DataKind UK. There's the OR Society that does some amazing, fairly advanced stuff. I would say, they try to kind of reach organisations where they're at. We ourselves have got an outsourced data team where if you don't want to hire someone, you could just hire some expertise for a short period of time to get you going and move you forward. So there are a range of support options available and some free things there. And again, ideas are often coming through at the Data Folk Club on how you can engage your staff. I think sometimes if you are the lone data person in an organisation, trying to get either senior leadership buy-in or the interest of your colleagues can sometimes be challenging, but not for everyone. And I feel really excited by the progress that people, the innovative and creative ideas that organisations come up with, even with very limited resources.
Well, and when we send out an email after this, we'll add some links in that might be interesting regarding this topic. So we have a page that's got where to get help with data with loads of different places, and some resources on kind of data basics, which is a thing we like to do to help start learning about data. Okay, this is another interesting question about skills and some analysis we might be able to do on skills. So have you done a gap analysis with skills for each role type, i.e. what skills does a team leader need, what does a data analyst need, and then compared the required skills to what people are reporting they have? This would be interesting to then target key training areas. So yes, I don't know whether maybe Hannah might want to talk a little bit about what the research we have done and what skills different roles need. And then...
Yes, so our data maturity assessment is specifically asking about the capabilities of the organisation as a whole. So we don't actually get an idea of the skills that people have as individuals from the data maturity assessment. However, this is something that we are thinking about. We have done quite a lot of research around the different types of skills that, as you say, different roles need. And yeah, starting to think about how we can help to fill those skills gaps, as you say, with targeted training. But yeah, at the moment, our data maturity assessment itself doesn't enable us to compare skills with that people should have in theory with what they are reporting that they have, because it's purely about the whole organisation and not about individuals.
Thanks, Hannah. And I would add to that we have been for several years tracking data jobs in the sector, and doing some salary benchmarking and just looking at how that's changing. And certainly we are starting to see more, analysts are definitely the biggest category. Probably, Hannah, you could add more on that. But, we do see engineers. We rarely see architects in the list of job adverts, I think. Head of data, senior roles versus, I think I should just let you answer this question, Hannah, because you did the recent analysis.
Yeah, the most common roles that we find advertised by non-profits are analysts, officers, and managers, or sort of team leads. So yeah, we're not finding a lot of role titles that are becoming quite popular in the commercial sector. So things like data architects or data engineers, these sort of more specialist roles. We're not seeing quite so much yet in the non-profit sector.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting from our Data Folk Club. Often we've got one data person who's looking after 200 people in their organisation, and they're doing all of the data roles. That's one of the things they say love, is that they're hugely versatile, but it does also mean they have everything to do. But then in many of the larger non-profit organisations, in both public and not-for-profit sector, you do have whole teams of data people who are working at this stuff, and they have that kind of challenge around how they engage with everybody else in the organisation.
Exactly.
I think one more question, and then we've got a few wrap-up things I'd like to do as well.
Okay. We'll go.
I think we should have what about the one for you, Libby, which is about direct relations being established from the data. For example, if skills is associated with analysis, or culture associated with uses, and so on.
Yes. So I wasn't sure with that question whether by conditioned you're referring to the order in which people are answering the questions, which is kind of an interesting way to look at it, because as you go through assessment, it's also kind of a learning tool. So by the time you get to then, you might think about things in different ways. Or the idea that the answers, causalities. Okay, yes. Well, that is something we have looked at. And actually, when we're doing the analysis and we're pulling out questions, we're seeing that things prime others. So when it came to the skills section, the data protection, it was in the skills section, do you get data protection training? And then in culture, kind of, is your data secure? And those things are linked. And we do see a high correlation between all themes. In the last data sector report, we found that culture was quite highly correlated, but that finding has kind of dwindled out a little bit. It seems to move how the different themes correlate with each other. I think tools is generally the least correlated between, the most independent, because you don't necessarily need super advanced tools to be able to do really great things with data, depending on what the needs of your organization are. So short answer, yes, there definitely is correlations. And even when it comes to things like data governance, that crosses lots of different themes. Yeah, don't know if Sian, you have anything to add?
No, I think it confirms our understanding that all of those are important factors in data maturity. And what we see is in the most advanced organisations is they're very rounded in their data maturity. So it feels like if you're really strong in some areas, you're best to bring up the rear, as it were, bring up your weaker areas in order to advance forward. We're almost out of time. Libby, I wonder if you could reshare the slides for us to share last couple of things with you. report itself, we should be getting an email imminently with a link to the full report. We've got the summary and the full beast available. Where are we? Let's go to, here we go. So we've got some events coming up. Please do join us. We've got an introduction to data maturity for organisations on the 13th of November. The next Data Folk Club is about dealing with messy data, as it all is. That's on the 14th of November. On the 20th of November, we're doing a course preview for our Data for Nonprofit Leaders course. And on the 27th of November, we've got we're focusing on those cohort assessments. So we'll have Scottish Government who are about to start their 5th cohort of organisations going through a data maturity assessment together. We'll also be talking to 10GM will be coming to talk to us about their work in the voluntary and community and social enterprise sector in Greater Manchester, and they've done a whole lot of work around, a whole sector in a geographic area there last year. And we'll be also having Nick Connolly from Every Youth, who's been doing we've been doing some cohort data maturity assessment in youth homelessness. So it'll be really interesting in all of those to hear from the horse's mouth. The first session will have Myeloma UK from Scotland will be coming to talk, and we will have Neath Port Talbot Council who have been through a data maturity assessment process. So we've got lots of exciting events on the horizon. Please don't be a stranger. Please do share the findings. We'll be putting it all out on LinkedIn. In fact, it's already on LinkedIn, I'm sure. But we'd be really grateful if you could comment there. We'll be asking you for feedback, and if you'd like us to have a follow-up discussion that's perhaps a bit more chatty than us webinaring, broadcasting to you like this, we would always love to talk to people about data maturity. So yes, thank you all very much for coming. Have a lovely day, and we will hopefully keep in touch. Thank you so much.